Testing?
Testing?
Great. Awesome. Okay, so today is Saturday, the 7th of February 2026. Time is 13 minutes past midnight. So I can't remember the last time I read Resident Evil Code Veronica, but I'm like halfway through now. So I've got 10 chapters down and there's like 9 to go. So I'll continue in a moment. So first I'll launch the TikTok live, and then if I get taken down on TikTok for saying words that are in the book, then that's okay. I'll just continue reading on YouTube, on Twitch, and then of course I'll upload the footage to YouTube as well. Right, so there you go. Okay, let's get back to the book then. So after I finish this book, I'll be playing Resident Evil 4 original first, and then remake, and then after that will be 5, 6, 7, 8, and then the new one, Requiem. Okay. So last time I read halfway through the book, so I've read 10 chapters of 19. So here we go. Next chapter is 11. Chapter 11. They pushed out into the dark, Steve ahead of Claire, leaving the office door open. There was just enough light to see where the hall branched right, which was all the light they needed. Right, walk, door on the right, walk, steps to the left. It looped through his mind. The direction simple, but he didn't want to make even a tiny mistake. The image of what Claire had pulled off his back was still fresh in his mind, and they didn't know what else the moths could do. 2 strides forward, and the first moth came at them. A whitish, silent blur, and Steve opened up. Bam, 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 3 shots, and the flapping thing disintegrated. Soft plop sounds as the pieces hit the floor, and here came the rest, fluttering out from the corridor he and Claire wanted. They flew on a dusty wave of rot smell, shadowy, flopping shapes. And what was that? The thick, hanging, man-size thing webbed against the ceiling? Don't think about it. Now, go now. Now, Steve said, and Claire ran out from behind him, darting to the right and down the hall as he opened fire again. 2 and 3 round bursts. Feathery pieces of wing and warm, repulsive goo rained down as he fired into the whirling dark shapes overhead, splashing him, making him gag. The moths dying as silently as they attacked. He felt one of them in his hair, felt something warm and wet touch his scalp, and frantically brushed at the top of his head, firing, knocking a sticky egg case away. "Open," Claire shouted, much closer than he expected, and though he had planned to back down the hall, firing as he went, the feel of that crop in his hair was the last straw. He ducked, covered his head with one arm, and sprinted. He saw her silhouette in a doorway on the right and plunged ahead, running directly into her outstretched arm. Claire grabbed a handful of his shirt and jerked him inside, slamming the door closed behind them, and then turned and started firing, blocking his body with hers. "Hey, what's—" Bam, bam. The room was huge, the shots echoing from faraway corners. There was a trace of light coming from somewhere, but Steve heard them before he saw them. Zombies, moaning, gasping, 3 or 4 of them closing in on their position. He could only make out their outlines, staggering and weaving forward. Saw 2 of them go down, but 2 more moving in to take their place. "I'm okay," he called out between rounds, and Claire stepped aside, shouting for him to take the right flank. Steve targeted and fired, blinking and squinting against the dark, trying to get headshots. He took down 3 of them, then a 4th, so close that he felt blood splashing his hand. He immediately wiped it against his pants, praying that he didn't have any open cuts, that he wouldn't run out of ammo, but there was another zombie, and another. And then Claire was pulling him again, and he stopped firing. Let her lead him through the dark, toward where the mining room was supposed to be. Behind them, zombies shuffled and wheeled, giving slow motion chase. He tripped over a warm body and stepped on another, feeling something crunch underfoot. But as helpless and afraid as he felt, it was nothing to suddenly hearing Claire cry out in pain, to feel her fingers leave his arm. Claire, terrified, Steve reached out for her, felt only air. "Watch your step, I stubbed my goddamn toe," Claire said irritably, no more than 2 feet away, and he felt his knees go weak. He could also feel a cold metal reeling against his shoulder. The steps to the mining room. They'd made it. Together they climbed a few steps, Claire still in front, and when she opened the door, real light spilled out in shafts, piercing the blackness. "Praise Jesus," Steve muttered, holding the door from behind as Claire stepped inside. And before he could follow, he heard that disturbed, girlish giggling that he'd come to know and hate. And Claire had slipped one hand behind her back and was motioning him to freeze. He let go of the door, and she didn't move, letting it settle on her hip as Alfred said something, and she slowly raised both her hands. It seemed Alfred had gotten the drop on Claire, but not on me, Steve thought. Unaware that he was wearing a tight, grim smile, Alfred had a lot to answer for, but Steve was pretty certain that in another minute or 2, he wasn't going to be saying much of anything ever again. He had her, as he had surmised. She had come to see about the tunnel, the one exit from the terminal that didn't require a key. She wasn't a stupid girl, by no means, and he was superior in intellect and strategy, among other things. Still, standing in the doorway, Claire raised her hands, her expression annoyingly blank. Why wasn't she afraid? "Drop your weapon," Alfred snapped, his finger on the rifle's trigger. His voice, naturally amplified by the mining pit that took up most of the floor, emanated throughout the icy chamber, sounding authoritative and a bit cruel. He liked the strong sound of it, and knew it was effective when she let the handgun drop from her fingers without hesitating. "Kick it toward me," he commanded, and she did so, the weapon clattering across the concrete. He didn't pick it up, instead kicking it beneath the rail to his left, both of them listening to her only hope bounce away over frozen rocks, lost to the depths of the icy pit. How wonderful to exert such control. "What happened to your travelling companion?" he asked, sneering. "Has he met with an accident? Oh, and step away from the door if you don't mind, and keep your hands when I can say them." I think she meant to put there where I can see them. Claire edged forward, the door mostly closing behind her. He saw a flash of some unhappy emotion cross her face. Knew immediately that he had scored a point. Less of a hot meal for father, it seemed, but he doubted the monstrosity would complain. He's dead, she said simply. What happened to Alexia? Or am I speaking to Alexia? You know, you two look so much alike. Shut your mouth, little girl, Alfred snarled. You don't deserve to say her name. You already know that it's time for her return. That's why your people attacked Rockford, to lure her out. Or were you hoping to kill her outright, to cut her short her first breath? Claire acted confused, determined to keep up her pretense, it seemed. But Alfred didn't want to hear any more of her lies. The game was losing interest for him. In the face of Alexia's imminent triumph, everything had paled by comparison. I already know it all, he snapped, so don't bother. Now, if you'll come with me. Claire suddenly looked up and right to the raised platform where the tunnel began. Look out, she shrieked, collapsing as Alfred spun around, seeing only the massive ice digger machine, the tunnel's dark entrance. And the door had crashed open behind Claire, the boy diving in and landing on his side, pointing a weapon at him. Furious, Alfred swung the rifle and pulled the trigger 3-4 times, but he hadn't had enough time to target properly, the explosive shots going wide. And it was as though a giant hand suddenly shoved Alfred backward, taking his breath away, the boy firing and then clicking on empty out of bullets. Alfred stumbled back another step and opened his mouth to laugh, ready to kill them both, and the rifle wasn't in his hands anymore. He dropped it for some reason, and his laugh was only a wet, painful cough. And something gave way behind his back, and then he was falling into the mining pit. He landed on a thick crest of ice and started to get up, but there was a great, searing pain in his chest. Was it possible that he'd been shot? With barely a sound, the ice gave way all around him, and he screamed, falling. He had to see her once more, had to touch her, but he could hear his father screaming, too, coming for him, and then everything was lost in pain and dark. The sound of the terrible, monstrous howl that had risen up to meet Alfred's got them moving, Claire pausing just long enough to grab the Remington before climbing after Steve to the high platform. With Steve on empty and her own gun kicked into the pit, it was their only weapon. They clambered into the cab of the huge yellow machine parked in front of the slanted, rising tunnel. Steve taking the wheel, and again they heard that deep, insane scream, and it was definitely closer, the monster prisoner loose somewhere inside. Steve flipped a bunch of switches, nodding and mumbling to himself as he went. Claire listened as she checked the rifle, only 6 rounds, gathering that the machine's digging device, an enormous screw-looking thing, actually heated up to melt the ice. She didn't care what it did, as long as it got them out before the monster came looking for them. With the heavy machine humming to life, Steve explained that the tunnel was probably unfinished because the workers would have had to go slowly and without using the heating element to avoid flooding half the facility. But we don't, he said, grinning. What do you say we make a leg? Go for it, she said, grinning back at him, wishing she felt a little more enthusiastic. God, they were getting out. And with Alfred Ashford finally dead, there was no one standing in their way. So, why was she still so uncertain? It's that shit he was babbling about his sister, crazy. Yeah, but it had brought up the one question she didn't have an answer for. Why had Rockford been attacked? Steve jammed on the throttle and the machine lurched forward. There weren't seatbelts, so Claire put one hand on the roof, the digger bouncing almost as much as their plane had right before it crashed. Their view was mostly blocked by the giant twisting screw thing, but it was obvious when they hit the end of the tunnel, big time. The noise was incredible, deafening, like rocks in a blender times 100. There was a burning steam smell, and as they inched forward through a total blackness, she could hear the thaw even over the digging as torrents of water rushed past the cab. The grinding waterfall noises seemed to go on forever as they continued to climb, and then the machine shuddered, jerking, and the threads were straining, and sudden light flooded into the cab, grey and shadowy and beautiful. The digger crawled out of its brand new hole near a standing tower, Claire recognising it as a helipad, even as Steve pointed out the snowcats parked near the base. It was snowing, fat wet flakes spinning down from a slate sky, the humid cold seeping into the cab before they'd been on the surface a minute. There was a wind blowing, the snow angled slightly. Not a big wind, but steady. "Copter or cat?" Steve asked lightly, but she could see that he was starting to shiver. So was she. "Your call, flyboy," she said. "A helicopter would be faster, but staying on the ground seemed safer. Can we even take off in this?" "As long as it doesn't get any worse," he said, looking up at the tower, but he didn't seem sure. She was about to recommend one of the cats when he shrugged, pushing his door open and sliding out, calling back over his shoulder. "I say we hit the tower, fly girl," he said. "We can at least see if there's actually a choice." She got out too, craning her neck back, but she couldn't see the top of the tower either. And it was cold, frostbite cold. "Whatever, let's just hurry," Claire said, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. Steve jogged for the stairs, Claire following, freezing but exhilarated, suddenly totally high on being free to choose, to decide what they wanted to do, how they wanted to do it, and either way, they'd be at the Australian station in an hour or so, wrapped in blankets and drinking something hot and telling their story. Well, at least the more believable part, she thought. Climbing the recently sanded stairs after him. Even the most open-minded people in the world wouldn't believe half of what they'd been through. Her happiness was wearing thin as they neared the top 3 stories later, her teeth chattering it away. And when Steve turned around, frowning, she no longer cared about much of anything beyond getting warm. "There's no helicopter," he said, snow starting to stick to his hair. "I guess we'll..." He saw something behind her, and his face suddenly contorted with horror and surprise. He reached out to pull her up, but she was already moving. "Go," she said, and he turned and bolted up the stairs, Claire barely a half step behind him. She didn't know what he'd sing. "Yes, you do." But from the look on his face, she knew she didn't want it behind her. "It's the thing, the monster. It was loose, and now it's coming for you," her fear helpfully provided. And then Steve was grabbing her arm and jerking her up from the last few steps. She stumbled onto a giant, empty, square platform, the landing lines mostly obscured by fresh snow, a grey haze of anomalous fog making it hard to see. "Give me the rifle," he breathed, and she ignored him, turned to see if it was true, if she would recognise the awful pain of the thing that had screamed so horribly. And as it gained the platform, she saw that it was true, and she recognised it with no trouble at all. She unslung the rifle and backed away, motioning for Steve to stay behind her. Alfred woke up in a world of pain. He could barely breathe, and there was blood on his face and in his nose and mouth. And when he tried to move, the agony was instant and overwhelming. Every inch of him was broken, cut, or smashed, or punctured, and he knew he was going to die. All that was left was his surrender to the dark. He was very afraid, but he ached so badly that perhaps sleep would be best. Alexia. He couldn't give up. Not when he had been so close. Not when he was still so close. He forced his eyes to open and saw a thin red haze that he was on one of the lower level platforms that jutted out into the mining pit. He'd fallen at least 3 levels, perhaps as many as 5. "Alexia," he whispered, and felt blood bubbling up from his chest, felt bones grinding as he shifted, felt afraid of the pain he'd have to endure. But he would go to her, because she was his heart, his great love. and he would be sustained by his name on her lips. "Give me the rifle," Steve said again, watching the thing take its first stumbling step in their direction. But Claire wasn't listening. She had her eye to the scope, was seeing what he saw, but under magnification. And what he saw was an abomination. Blindfolded, its hands tied behind its back, wearing only a shapeless and stained cut of leather knotted around its waist. The thing had suffered horribly, that much was clear. He could see the raised scars, the ancient welts, bloody shackle marks around its ankles. It looked almost human, but for its oversized body and strange flesh, grey and mottled, sitting over lean muscles that had ruptured through in places, exposing raw tissue. Its torso was bare, and I could see a kind of pulsing redness in the centre of its chest, a clear target, and for a few seconds Steve thought they were safe after all. It doesn't have any weapons. And there was a splintering, cracking sound, and 4 asymmetrical appendages, like the jointed legs of an insect, unfolded from its back and upper body, the longest easily 10 feet tall, curling from its right shoulder like a scorpion's tail. It reeled forward another step, and some dark liquid was spraying from its body, from its chest or back. As the droplets struck the frozen cement, a thick purplish-green gas began to hiss upward from where they landed, blown by the snowy wind, first one direction, then another. It rumbled out some heavy, wordless sound and took another step toward them, the new arms whipping around its hairless head, making it weave from side to side. It could barely keep its balance, and as the thought occurred to him, Steve was already running. "Go in low, head down, knock it off while it's still at the edge." "Steve," Claire screamed fearfully, but he was almost there, close enough for the acrid tinge of its self-produced gas to sear his nostrils. "Has to be poison. Gotta keep it away from her." And just before he rammed into it, something viciously shoved him, slammed into his back and pushed, sending him flying to the ground. "Steve!" Claire screamed again, this time in absolute horror, because he was skidding across the icy cement on his side, and though he tried to stop himself, scrabbling at the frozen platform with frozen fingers, there was suddenly no platform left. Steve was only a few feet from the monster when its strange arm whipped down over them both, hitting Steve in the back and hurling him to the side. "Steve!" Steve skipped across the frozen platform like a flat stone on water and disappeared over the edge. "Oh my God, no." Claire doubled over, the emotional pain hitting her like a physical blow, sharp and hard in her gut. He'd been trying to protect her, and it had cost him his life. For a second, she couldn't move or breathe, couldn't feel the cold, didn't care about the monster, but only for a second. She looked at the stumbling, tortured animal staggering toward her, knew without doubt that the fury that heard came from long, hard years of abuse, of experimentation, and felt nothing. Her heart unsealed itself up, her mind suddenly colder than her body. She straightened, jacking around into the chamber of the rifle, appraising the situation with a clear eye. Obviously, she could outrun it, leave it on the platform, and be a mile away before it found its way back down. But that wasn't an option, not anymore. Its death would be a mercy, but that didn't figure into her calculations either. It killed Steve, and now I'm going to kill it, she thought coolly, and walked to the northwest corner of the platform, the farthest from the stairs, its appendages flailing over its head. The monster wove around in a painfully slow half-circle, its blind face finally turned in her direction. It let out another deep, gasping, mindless sound, and its body vomited out more of that smoking liquid, some kind of acid or poison probably. She wondered who had created such a thing, and how this was no T-virus zombie, and from its abused and tormented state, it wasn't a BOW either. She supposed she'd never know. Claire raised the rifle and looked through the scope, focusing in on the pulsating tissue in the centre of its chest, then raising to target his blank grey face. She didn't know about the tissue mass at its heart, but she was sure it wouldn't survive a headshot by 30.06. She didn't want to waste time stalking it or inflicting unnecessary pain. She just wanted it dead. She aimed at the centre of his forehead. It had a strong jaw and fine, straight nose beneath the puckered flesh, as though it had once been handsome, even aristocratic. Maybe it's another Osford, she thought mockingly, and fired. The monster's head split apart, almost seemed to shatter as the round found its mark. Shards of bone and brain matter flew, all of it as grey as the grey sky, steam rising up from the broken bowl of its skull as it fell first to its knees, the mutant arms spasming in the snowy air, then onto its ruined face. Claire felt nothing. No pleasure, no dismay, not even pity. It was dead, that was all, and it was time for her to go. She didn't feel the cold, but her body was shaking violently, her teeth rattling, and she knew she had to get warm. Claire? The voice was weak and shuddering and unmistakably Steve's, coming from the platform's east edge. Claire stared at the empty space for a split second, entirely dumbfounded, and then ran, dropping to her hands and knees beneath the soft patter of snow, leaning out to see him awkwardly wrapped around a support post, clinging to the frozen metal with both arms and one leg. His face was almost blue with cold, but when he saw her, his eyes lit up, a look of incredible relief crossing his pale features. "You're alive," he said. "That's my line," she answered, dropping the rifle and bracing herself against the edge, leaning down to grab his arm. It was a struggle, but in another moment Steve was back on the platform, and they were on their knees, embracing, too cold to do anything but hang on. "I'm so sorry, Claire," he said miserably, his face buried in her shoulder. "I couldn't stop it." Her heart had unsealed when she'd seen him alive, and now tightened painfully. He was all of 17 years old, his whole life ripped apart by Umbrella, and he'd just very nearly died trying to save her life again, and he was sorry. "Don't worry, I got it this time," she said, determined not to cry. "You get the next one, okay?" Steve nodded, sitting back on his heels to look at her. "I will," he said, so vehemently that she had to smile. "Cool," she said, and crawled to her feet, reaching down to help him up. "That'll save me some work. Now, let's go catch Cat, yes?" Supporting each other and staying close for warmth, they made their way to the stairs, neither of them willing to let go. Okay, end of chapter 11. Chapter 12 next. Oh yeah, free Sudan and free Iran. Well, I'm sure they can sort out themselves. Free all of the possessed, of course. And of course, free Palestine and free freedom for the First Nations and for Congo and for all of the oppressed and the Aboriginals. Freedom for Aotearoa. For the Maori, yeah, all of them. What? Okay, chapter 12. Alexia Osford watched her twin die at her feet, bleeding and in great pain, reaching out to touch the stasis tank with adoration in his dying eyes. He had never been particularly bright or competent, but she had loved him very much. His death was a great sadness, but also the sign she had been waiting for. It was time to come out. She had known for some months that the end would be soon, or rather, the beginning, the emergence of a new life on Earth. Her stasis had remained stable for most of the 15 years she'd needed, her mind and body unaware of life, unaware that she was suspended in freezing amniotic fluid. Her cells her cells slowly changing and adapting to T. Veronica. In the past year, however, that had changed. She had hypothesized that, given enough time, T. Veronica would raise consciousness to new levels, expanding areas of the mind that would surpass simplistic human senses, and she had been correct. For the last 10 months, she had begun experiencing herself in spite of stasis, testing her awareness, and she had been able to see through her human eyes when she wished. Alexia reached out with her mind and turned off the support machines. The tank began to drain, and she stared out at her dear brother, most unhappy that he had died. She could choose not to employ her emotions, but she had been human with him. It seemed appropriate. When the tank was empty, Alexia opened it, stepping out into her new world. There was power everywhere, hers for the taking. But now she sat down in front of the tank and laid Alfred's bloody heap in her lap, experiencing the sadness. She began to sing a child's song that her brother had liked, stroking his hair back from his drawn face. There was sadness in the lines around his eyes and mouth, and she wondered what his life had been like. She wondered if he had stayed at Rockford, stayed at Veronica's home, the home of their ancestors. Still singing, Alexia reached out to her father and was surprised to find him missing, either dead or beyond her range of perception. She had touched his mind only recently, studying what was left of it. In a way, he was responsible for what she had become. The T. Veronica had turned his mind to sludge, had driven him insane, as it would have to her if she hadn't tested it on him first. She stretched her awareness, finding sickness and death in the upper levels of the terminal. A pity. She had been looking forward to beginning her experiments again, immediately, without test subjects. She had no reason to stay. She found 2 people not far from the umbrella facility and decided to flex her control over substance to see how much effort it took, and found that it was hardly an effort at all. She concentrated for just a few seconds, saw a male and female inside of a snow machine, and wished for them to be brought back to the facility. Instantly, lines of organic matter tore through the ice, ripping toward the vehicle. Amused, Alexia watched with her senses as a giant tentacle of new-formed substance rose up and curled around the machine, lifting it effortlessly into the air and then threw it back at the facility. The machine tumbled end over end, its engine bursting into flame, and came to rest against one of the umbrella buildings. Both were still alive, she thought, and was well pleased. She could use one of them in an experiment she had been thinking about for weeks, and would surely find a good use for the other in due time. Alexia continued to sing to her dead brother, intrigued by the changes she could see coming, looking forward to gaining a fuller mastery of her new powers. She stroked his hair, dreaming. Chapter 13. Things fell to shit pretty fast when he finally reached the island. Chris stood at the top of the cliff in the early night, catching his breath and suddenly cursing himself. Everything had been in that bag: weapons and ammo, rappelling equipment so they could get back down to the boat, flashlight, a basic first aid kit, everything. Not everything. You've still got 3 grenades on your belt, his mind told him brightly. Terrific. Halfway up the cliff, he loses his grip and drops the bag into the deep blue sea, but it appeared he still had his sense of humour. Yeah, that'll go a long way towards saving Claire's life. Barry was right. I should have brought backup. Well, he could stand around all goddamn day wishing things were different, or he could get moving. He picked moving. Chris hunched over and stepped into the low cave entrance he had chosen to start at, an isolated area but definitely connected to the rest of the compound. There was a radio antenna on the ledge outside, and when he straightened up a few steps later, he was inside a large open room, the walls and ceiling organic but the floor carefully levelled. There was light somewhere ahead, and Chris started for it, Keeping his fingers crossed as he wasn't about to walk into an umbrella military dinner. He doubted it. But from what he had seen of the island, the attack Claire had mentioned had been excessively brutal. He was less than a dozen steps into the shadowy chamber when a small tremor shook the cave, spilling rock dust and pebbles over his head and closing the cave entrance he had just walked through, collapsing rock having a fairly distinctive sound. It seemed the island attack had made things a bit unstable. "Oh, wonderful," he muttered. He was suddenly a bit happier about the grenades. Not that they would help much here. Even if he could blow the mouth without bringing all of it down, it was still too high to jump, and the rope had been in the bag unless he'd been taking lessons. Claire wasn't a good enough rock climber to go down unassisted. "What?" someone rasped, and Chris dropped into a defensive crouch, searching the shadows, and saw a man on the cave floor, slumped against the wall. He wore a tattered white t-shirt with blood on it, his pants and boots military. He was one of umbrellas and not in very good shape. Nevertheless, Chris stepped quickly to his side, ready to kick the shit out of him if he so much as sneezed. I didn't know anyone was still around," the man said weakly and coughed a little. "Thought I was the last one after the self-destruct." He coughed again, obviously not far away from his death. His words sank in, creating a lead ball in Chris's stomach. "Self-destruct?" He crouched down, trying to keep his voice level. "I'm here looking for a girl. Her name is Claire Redfield. Do you know where she is?" At the sound of Claire's name, the man smiled, though not at Chris. "She's an angel. She's gone. Escaped. I helped her. Let her go. She tried to save me, but it was too late." Hope bloomed anew. "Are you sure she got away?" The Dan man nodded. "Heard the planes leave. Saw a jet come out of the basement under the tank. You should go too. Nothing left here." Chris could feel some of his stress and fear ebbing away, tensions in his neck and back releasing. If she was gone, she was safe. "Thank you for helping her," he said sincerely. "What's your name?" Rodrigo Raval." "I'm Claire's brother Chris," he said. "Let me help you, Rodrigo. It's the least I can do." And yeah, a deafening animal cry filled the cave, and at the same instant another tremor struck, a bad one, the ground shaking so hard that Chris was thrown off his feet. And earth erupted, what Chris thought was an explosion at first, a fountain of dirt and rocks spraying upward, but it kept rising, and Chris could see thick, filth-coated slime beneath it, could smell sulphur and decay, saw a huge cylinder made of rubber still climbing, and then it shrieked again, the top of the cylinder twisting around, wormy tentacles peeling back from a yawning, howling throat. And Chris scrambled to his feet, grabbing a grenade from his belt, and the giant shrieking snake worm came crashing down, mouth open, and swallowed Rodrigo whole before slamming into the sandy soil where he'd been sitting. It dove into the ground like a swimmer into water, its impossibly long body arching over, following through. Jesus. Chris stumbled away as the ground continued to quake, the burrowing creature kicking up rock and dirt and sand all around him, and he realised that he had to kill it or get away fast, that it could easily come up beneath him for another quick snack. He ran to the outer wall of the cave, making a split-second plan as the snake worm burst up through the ground behind him, its insane mouth peeling open as it hesitated at the top of its arch, ready to plunge down over him, rocks falling all around. And Chris pulled the safety ring off the grenade, stripping the tape and pin away, and ran straight for the creature's lower body where it emerged from the ground. Crazy, this is crazy. He ducked just before hitting the filthy, muscular body and set the grenade on the ground in front of it, on the run, as careful as he could be not to set it off, and then dived for cover behind the snake worm's twisting body, tucking into a shoulder roll, covering his head as the animal started downward, shrieking. And boom, the explosion shook the ground even harder than the animal had. The shriek cut off, the grenade blast muffled by a half-ton of worm guts that shot out in all directions, stinking and warm, painting the walls of the cave in vicious bucket loads. Chris rolled on his back, drenched, watched the front half of the animal convulse and writhe, already dead, and as his muscles and reflexes clenched and released for the last time, the snakeworm expelled a gush of stomach acid and rock from its gaping maw, vomiting out its last meal. Rodrigo, before the massive corpse had completely settled to the ground, Chris was at Rodrigo's side, horrified and helpless, the man seizing in shock and pain. He was coated in yellow bile, and Chris could see places where it had already burned through his skin. Rodrigo let out a soft cry, too weak to scream in what had to be incredible pain, and Chris tore his own jacket off, wiping his face clean of the sticky, acidic fluid. "You're going to be okay, just relax, don't try to talk," Chris said, fully aware that Rodrigo would be dead in minutes, perhaps seconds. He kept talking and kept his tone soothing in spite of his own dismay. Rodrigo opened his eyes, and though they were full of suffering, they also had the wet, glassy, faraway look of someone leaving it all behind, someone about to be free of pain and fear. "Right pocket," Rodrigo whispered. "The angel gave for luck." Rodrigo took a slow, deep breath and let it out just as slowly, an exhalation that seemed to go on forever, and then he was gone. Chris automatically closed his half-open eyes, simultaneously sad and relieved at Rodrigo's passing, the end of a life, but also an end to dying. "Rest, friend." Sighing, Chris reached into Rodrigo's pocket, felt skin-worn metal, and pulled out the scuffed, heavy old lighter that he had given to Claire himself a long time ago for luck. Chris held it to his chest, suddenly overwhelmed by a rush of love for his sister. She'd carried the lighter with her everywhere for years, but had given it up to ease the mind of a Dan man, possibly one of the men responsible for her capture. He slipped it in his pocket and stood, glad that he'd be able to give it back to her, and to tell her that she'd made a difference in Rodrigo's last hours, that he had smiled upon hearing her name. Even though Claire didn't need to be rescued, Chris's trip to the island had already turned out to be worthwhile. The stink of the splattered cave was getting to him, and now that he knew his sister was safe, all that was left was to get himself home. His entrance had been caved in, and he didn't have a decent weapon, but if someone had triggered Umbrella's self-destruct system, it seemed that other illegal facilities were built with such fail-safes in place, a fine way to destroy evidence if anything went wrong. Then he shouldn't run into too much trouble looking for the tank that Rodrigo had mentioned, see if there was another jet to be had. "No going back," he said softly, and with a final silent prayer for Rodrigo to find peace, he went to see what he could find. There was a fight about to happen on one of the monitors in what was left of the control room, and Albert Wesker, frustrated by a day of fruitless searching and not looking forward to yet another long flight, pulled up a crate and sat down to watch. He'd already sent the boys back to the world. He was alone, except it appeared that he had missed somebody, and said somebody was still wandering around the island. But not for much longer, he thought happily, wishing the reception was better. Thanks to that lonesome loser, Alfred Ashford, the self-destruct system had screwed everything up, and finally something interesting was actually going to happen. Christ, he's unarmed. Crazy or stupid or totally ignorant of what the island was, no question. Wesker grinned. The unarmed man was walking through the training facility just one floor below, and he was about to meet up with one of Umbrella's newer bioorganics, one that had been trapped down in the sewers until Wesker had shown up and set it free. They were one hallway apart. When the dumbass turned the next corner, he was dead. Wesker adjusted his glasses, pleasantly diverted from his own troubles. Sweepers, Umbrella was calling the new monsters, but they were basically hunters with poison claws, huge, primarily amphibious, violent as hell. In Wesker's opinion, the hunters, the 1-to-1 series, were perfectly badass without the extra poison touch. But isn't that just like Umbrella, always wasting resources playing games when they could be winning wars? Yes, it was, but there was but there was about to be bloodshed. Wesker set aside the distaste for the company and leaned in to watch. The weaponless idiot, a tall guy with reddish brown hair that was about all the static would allow, was 2 steps from disaster. The sweeper waiting just around the corner. When he stopped and backed up a step, pressing himself against the damaged wall, Wesker frowned. The man started to back up, slowly and carefully, still hugging the wall. Okay, maybe not a complete idiot. He'd made it halfway back down the corridor. He'd come through when the sweeper finally got impatient, deciding to take action. There was no sound system left, but the creature had thrown back its head and was screaming. That weird, trilling screech floating up to Wesker through the ruined building just a split second later. Get him, Wesker breathed eagerly, looking back at the poor, doomed dumbass, just in time to see him throw in something small and dark, and the sweeper leaping out from behind the corner, still screaming, the object landing at his feet. And the building was shaking, the screens going white and then black, the deep thunder of explosives rumbling the floor. Wesker was astounded and then furious. That creature had been a miracle of science, a warrior created for battle. Who was this dick who'd just rambled in and blown it to shit? A dead dick, Wesker thought darkly, pushing the crate away and heading for the stairs. He took them 2 at a time, carefully bypassing a few still burning fires, aware that he was channeling all his frustrations and upsets toward the unknown soldier, and not particularly Karen. Alexia wasn't at Rockford, which meant he had to get his ass to the Antarctic of all places, to the only other facility she might be at. Why else would Alfred have gone there? And if Wesker didn't get to her before she woke up, he might have to go home empty-handed. All of which added up to failure, and if there was one thing Wesker hated, it was losing. He marched through the crumbling leftovers of the training facility, reaching the hall he wanted, silencing his steps as he edged farther along. There was still smoke in the air when he reached the corner where the conflict had taken place, but little left of the sweeper. Most of it was stuck to the walls and ceiling. There, ahead and to the left, he could smell the intruder, could smell sweat and anxiety emanating from the small working lab to which he had retreated. This is going to hurt you more than it hurts me, he thought, his mood lifting somewhat at the thought of a little personal interaction. Not wanting to get blown up, Wesker didn't hesitate, didn't give the guy a chance to get paranoid. He strode into the room, saw the soon-to-be corpse standing with his back turned, and moved. Moved the way only he could move. 1 second he was walking through the door, the next he was spinning the intruder around, lifting him by his throat, and then looking into the startled face of Chris Redfield. Oh my. Chris, who'd been on the Raccoon Stars, who'd been led under Wesker's command to the Spencer estate where he'd proceeded to thoroughly screw up Wesker's plans. Chris Redfield had cost him money, had almost cost him his life, but worst of all, he had been primarily responsible for the biggest failure in Wesker's career. Wesker recovered himself quickly, a dark, wonderful joy spreading through his entire body. Chris Redfield, as I live and breathe, what brings you to Rockford, if you don't mind me? Wesker trailed off, still gazing up into Redfield's increasingly red face as he uselessly pried at Wesker's fingers. The girl, of course. He hadn't even known that Chris had a sister, but the deranged letter that Alfred Ashford had so thoughtfully left behind explained everything, including his plans for the young Claire Redfield. She's not here, Wesker said, grinning. With his free hand, he straightened his sunglasses. You're dead, Chris gasped, and Wesker grinned wider, not bothering to respond to such a stupid statement. Don't change the subject, Chris. Don't you want to know where Claire is, Did you know that her plane took a little unplanned detour to the Antarctic? Chris was slowly choking to death, but Wesker could see that the news of his sister was hitting him harder than his own imminent demise. Wonderful. There are experiments being performed there, Wesker whispered, as if telling him a secret. I plan on going myself, see if I can get an experiment or two of my own going. Tell me, is your sister good looking? Do you think she might be interested in getting some action? Because I've got a heart on like you wouldn't believe. Chris fleeled at Wesker, the helpless fury in his eyes absolutely gorgeous. He hit Wesker in the face, knocking his sunglasses to the ground, and Wesker laughed, blinking up at him slowly, letting him see. He still wasn't used to it himself, the gold-red cat's eyes occasionally surprising him when he looked in a mirror, and they had exactly the effect he'd hoped for. What are you? Chris rasped out. I'm better, that's what, Wesker said. New employers, you know. After the Spencer estate, I needed a little help getting back on my feet, which they were perfectly willing to provide. You think Claire will like it? Monster, Chris spat. I'll show you, monster, you shit. Wesker started to close his hand slowly, watching Chris's eyes bulging, a vein on his forehead popping out. And was stopped by the sound of laughter, cool, female laughter, filling the room surrounding them. Don't you want to play with me? A voice said, the same woman, low and sexy and dangerous. And then she began to laugh again, an unmerciful, beautiful sound that finally trailed away to nothing. Alexia. God, she was awake, and the kind of power it would take for her to look in on him here, to project herself so far. Wesker threw Chris to one side, barely hearing the plaster wall crack beneath his useless skull, his thoughts full of Alexia. He had to go to her immediately. He had to have her, and not just for the sample, though he'd take what he could get. I'm coming, he said, scooping up his sunglasses and then moving, speeding through the broken facility to where his private plane waited. Chris Redfield was his past. Alexia Osford meant his future. Chris crawled to his feet soon after Wesker left, aching in about a dozen places, his throat horribly sore. He didn't know what had happened exactly, didn't know who the woman was or why Wesker had seemed so eager to get to her, but he understood now who had attacked Rockford and suspected the reason. Albert Wesker should have died when the Spencer mansion had burned, but it seemed he had sold his soul to someone new at the price of his life, someone obviously as nasty and immoral as Umbrella, someone who was perfectly willing to kill for whatever it was they wanted, for something that Umbrella had. Chris didn't care. At the moment, all he cared about was Claire, and getting himself to this Antarctic facility. He knew that Umbrella had a legitimate base there. It had to be the same one, and if it wasn't, somebody there would know where the experiments were taking place. He had one grenade left. If he could find the underground airport, he'd have no trouble getting inside, and he could fly anything with wings. He'd radio on the way for a read on the Umbrella base, and if he could find a weapon to get her out, he'd use his bare hands. All that mattered was Claire, and he was on his way. Cool. Okay, so... Chapter 14 next. I'll be right back. I'll get another drink. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so I've been reading for 50 minutes or so. I think I'll stop for. Yeah, so I looked up before how often you should take breaks when doing long reading streams. So if you're reading for a long time, then you should take a break every for 5 minutes every 25 minutes, or for 10 minutes every 50 minutes. So yeah, I'll continue 20 past, maybe quarter past. Hello, I'm Palestine, but I don't support. Oh, good. Okay, great. Yep, so had some apple juice there, and now I've got an iced latte. I think I'll take one of these lockets to these are like medicinal sweets that clear up your airways. They're extra strong. Andrew X. Yeah, I follow him. He's a great lad. Yeah, so about all of that is that wherever there's any group of people, see, most people, no matter where they are, who they are, like to see themselves as good people. But wherever there are any group of people, there's always people within those groups that want to get richer and more powerful by exploiting their own. So they'll betray their own people in order to get richer and more powerful. But the thing is that usually ends up creating problems. And instead of taking responsibility for their own actions, those corrupt people usually end up being in positions of power within those groups. And then whenever they cause problems within the group, they don't take responsibility for their actions, and instead point the blame at other groups of people. So yeah, even before Zism was a thing, there were always people like them. How are things going in Ireland? Great. this Made in Palestine cafe. Yep, I've got quite a few stuff that's made in Palestine. Yeah. So all the stories since the end of World War II, comics and movies, TV shows, and all of that, they were all like warnings about this kind of thing from happening again. That's why a lot of those stories say things like you should never give in to fear or hate and stuff like that. Like Star Wars is like anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And then you've got Daredevil. Both Daredevil and Ghost Rider say you can't give in to fear. So you see the message with that is that when people allow fear and anger to take over, they basically, those emotions cloud their judgment and stop them from thinking clearly, and it allows corrupt forces to easily manipulate them. Usually those corrupt forces like blame other groups of people for the problems that they cause themselves, but then there's always people who end up believing the lies of the corrupt. So those corrupt people are now in control of several governments worldwide. I'm very scared of how the world acts right now. So so in stories with like superheroes and stuff like that, you have like in the comics and cartoons and everything, you have the superheroes like trying to take matters into their own hands. They become vigilantes. They're trying to stop criminals. So they stop the criminals. The criminals get arrested by the police, sent to jail, but then through a corrupt system or an insufficient system, they end up escaping, and the criminals end up being back on the streets, and then it's just a rinse and repeat thing, and the superheroes keep doing the same cycle over and over and over again. So so that kind of story is deliberate because and the writers are aware of this kind of story. So they have it designed like this on purpose to show a point. So the point of the message is that if one person takes things into their own hands and tries to make things better, sure, maybe they'll save a few people, but they're not really going to make a big change if the system is already broken. So the only way real change can happen is when the people as a whole come together and have had enough. So you see, the thing is, if one person stands up against injustice, they can easily be targeted and by the corrupt forces and made an example of. But if people as a group come together and stand up against injustice, the corrupt forces can't do anything about that. And instead, it's the people that are the ones that end up driving the corrupt forces away, and they're the force that brings change. So that's the message behind those stories. Really, is that the I'm trying to think about how to say it right. The power of the people is always greater than the people in power. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. The power of the people is always greater than the people in power. Also, it's not only the villains escaping as a sign of broken system, but also the reason the villains were created in the first place. Yes. But then, corrupt societies, they like to accuse people of being villains, especially if they're resisting and are challenged to their system. So yeah. So the thing is that the problem is always the government. So all governments lie, and so all governments lie, and they often work against their own people. All right, so it's after 20 past, so back to the story. Okay, chapter 14. So I'll take my next break at 10 past 2. It's 1:22. Okay, chapter 14. They were mere hours away. Two men connected by history. One her enemy, the other. Alexia didn't know about the other, not yet, but knew that he meant to reclaim the girl she'd taken from the snow machine. Probably the boy as well. None of them would be leaving, of course, but she was looking forward to the petty intrigues and overblown, self-important dramas that their humanity would bring to her home. She would enjoy the chance to observe their natural tendencies and instincts before forever altering their lives. She stood in the great hall, considering things, possible features, her next transformation, the structural and psychological changes her synthesis would create in humans, how she would welcome her new guests. It had occurred to her that her home, deep beneath the ice and snow, might be difficult for them to achieve. She immediately wished for the doors to be opened, for obstacles to be removed, and she heard and saw and felt the result in the same instant, existing in 100 places at once, as locks were broken and walls were taken down, as debris was pushed aside and apertures were widened. She was prepared. Things would move quickly now, and what happened in the next hours would, to a degree, define her choices for some time to come. It was all still so new, the templates of her new life written only in sand. Smiling at her own poetic notions, Alexia went to see about the first series of injections for the boy. Okay, chapter 15. Something was very, very wrong in Umbrella's Antarctica facility, but Chris didn't know what it was. On the 5th basement level of the dark and deserted compound, hundreds of feet beneath the snow, Chris stood in front of what appeared to be a full-blown mansion made of white brick. There was a fountain behind him, potted plants, even a decorative merry-go-round. He had been led there, presumably because someone wanted him to go inside, but he didn't know who or why. His instincts were telling him to get the hell out, but he ignored them. He had to, not knowing if he was a lamb being led to slaughter or if he was being taken to Clare. Since landing the jet in the roof hangar, he'd been guided every step of the way, walking into halls and having doors locked behind him, others opening up in front of him. Twice he'd found jewels on the cold cement floors, pointing him in a particular direction, and once, after taking a wrong turn, all of the lights had gone out. They'd come back on when he'd groped his way back to where he'd gone wrong. It had been strange enough just getting to the facility, passing over the endless miles of grey ice and snow, and then seeing it for the first time, rising up from the plane, blank plains like an illusion. But to be herded someplace like an animal, shuffled along without knowing the reason. Chris was scared, more scared than he wanted to admit. He tried to stop, to look around for weapons or clues, but everything had been shut off. Every door he tried locked, except for the ones he was supposed to go through, of course. The cameras that had to be watching his every move were so well hidden that he hadn't seen even one of them, but it almost seemed that his shepherd knew his mind, knew what signals to give him, knew how to keep him going. He thought initially that it was Wesker, but it was all some setup to trap him. But why bother? He could have strangled Chris at the island if he'd wanted to. No, he was being guided for some other reason, and it seemed he had no choice but to follow along, not if he wanted to find Claire. He took a deep breath and opened the front door of the mansion, stepping inside. It was beautiful, as extravagant as the front of the building had suggested. Grand staircase, arched pillars, and strangely familiar, though it took him a moment to see how. The colours and decorations different. It was the layout, the same basic layout as the front hall of the Spencer mansion. It was surreal, but so perfectly harmonious with all the other weirdness that he didn't bat an eye. Chris stood for a moment, waiting, looking around for another signal, and then he heard what he sounded like a laugh coming from behind the stairs. It was the same laugh that he had heard at the Rockford facility. That woman, what had she said? Something about wanting to play? It definitely felt like a game, like he was a character being moved around for someone else's enjoyment, and was starting to piss him off. That he was afraid only made him angrier. Chris stalked toward the back wall, ready to confront this woman, to demand some answers. But when he stepped around one of the decorative pillars, he saw that there was no one there. What the hell is this? He muttered, turning, and there was Claire, webbed to the back of the stairs, as if by some giant spider, her eyes closed, her head hanging limply. Wesker wasn't surprised to find that parts of the Antarctic compound had been built to look like parts of the Spencer estate. The underground extravagance was an incredible waste, but as he had noted many times before, so like Umbrella. It was all about intrigue for them, back at the beginning, before it all turned into a bad spy movie. Oswald Spencer and Edward Osford had been responsible for the creation of the T-virus, but it had been their only real accomplishment. The rest was money thrown away. Truly, the entire facility, except for the laboratories, of course, was an expensive joke, set up by the old men and children with little imagination and too much money. Aware that Alexia was probably watching, Wesker took his time, moving from level to level, clearing away a few wandering zombies as he walked. He wasn't carrying a weapon, had simply snapped their necks and left them to asphyxiate. Twice he was spotted by other creatures, things he had sensed and not seen, but they hadn't attacked, perhaps recognizing him as one of their own. Wesker kept moving, sure that Alexia would find him when she was ready. He'd landed his jet some distance from the compound, wanting to be sure that she understood how he was different, that the elements didn't affect him, that he was physically stronger than any 5 men put together. with better endurance and sharper senses. He also wanted her to see that he was respectful of her space, that he was willing to be patient, and that he was extremely determined. "Whenever you want, my sweet," he thought, walking through a cold room corridor on the fifth basement floor. He'd been through the area already, but knew that the mansion was there and suspected that she would want to greet him in high style. It didn't matter to him. She could drop in on him in a toilet stall for all he cared, but he thought she was probably as vain and spoiled as her brother. However powerful and brilliant she was also a 25-year-old rich girl who had spent 15 of those years sleeping. Rich, beautiful, playful. She probably didn't even understand her powers yet, but it wouldn't be long now. He could feel it. He left the icy stillness of the cold corridor and started for the mansion once again. Claire woke slowly, her aching body gently supported by warm hands that lifted and held her. She was laid down, the cold floor bringing her round, and when she opened her eyes, she saw her brother smiling at her. "Chris," she sat up and embraced him, ignoring her sore muscles, so happy to see him for that moment. She forgot everything else. It was Chris. It was him, finally. "Hey sis," he said, fiercely hugging her back, the familiar sound of his voice making her warm and safe. She wished it could last forever, after so long. "Claire, I think we ought to get out of here now," he said, and she could hear a thread of concern behind his words that woke her up, that reminded her of all that had happened. "I don't know exactly what's going on, but I don't think it's safe." "We have to find Steve," she said, and started to get to her feet, worried. Chris helped her, supporting her while she steadied herself. Who's Steve?" "A friend," Claire said. "We got away from Rockford together, and we were about to get away from here too, but some kind of creature grabbed our snowmobile and threw it." She looked up at Chris, suddenly more than just worried. "Before I blacked out, I heard him say my name. He's alive, Chris. We can't leave him." "We won't," Chris said firmly, and Claire felt weak with relief. Chris had come. He knew all about Umbrella. He'd be able to find Steve and take them away. Laughter. A woman was laughing, a high, cruel laugh. Chris stepped out from behind the stairs, Claire following, both of them looking up to the balcony. And then there was the woman. It was Alfred? No, not Alfred. And that meant there really is an Alexia, Claire said softly. Go goddamn figure. Still laughing, Alexia Ashford turned and walked away, exiting through a door at the top of the stairs. Okay, next. Still laughing, Alexia Ashford turned and walked away, exiting through a door at the top of the stairs. She might know where Steve is, Chris said urgently, even as it occurred to Claire. And then both of them were running, climbing, Claire quickly outpacing him, ready to slap the truth out of Alfred's creepy sister. And crash behind her, the stairs falling away, Claire rolling to the floor as a huge tentacle smashed through the balcony, like in the snowcat. And then it was gone, retreating through the hole it had created, leaving a trashed set of side stairs behind. The main staircase was still whole, but Claire was stuck on the second floor on a shattered wood island. She'd have to climb down. Claire. She crawled to her feet, saw Chris down below, wincing at some pain in his leg amid the broken wood and plaster. "Are you okay?" Claire asked, and Chris nodded. And then there was a scream, and she felt blood run cold. She felt her blood run cold. It came from beyond the door that Alexia had gone through, and it was Steve. There was no question in Claire's mind. It was Steve, and he was in pain. "Can't leave Chris, but..." "Chris, it's him," Claire said, looking between her brother and the door, not sure what to do. "Go, I'll catch up," Chris called. "But..." "Go, I'll be fine, just be careful." Terrified, Claire turned and ran, hoping she wasn't too late. Wesker stepped into the grand foyer of the underground mansion and saw it wasn't quite so grand anymore. Something had happened to the stairs. Part of the upper balcony was now smashed to the floor. He heard someone moving around behind a huge, jagged piece of balcony still hanging from the tattered carpet, and took a step toward it. And there she was, standing at the top of the stairs in a long, dark dress, silky blonde hair tied back from her pale, beautiful face. "Alexia Osford," Wesker said, surprised to find himself somewhat in awe now that the moment was at hand. She looked human, delicate and helpless, but he knew better. Make your pitch and make it good. Wesker cleared his throat, stepping forward and taking off his sunglasses. "Alexia, my name is Albert Wesker. I represent a group who has long admired your work and have been eagerly awaiting your return." She watched him impassively, head tilted slightly, her back straight and stiff. She looked like a debutante at her first society party. "And may I add that it's a personal honour to meet you," Wesker said sincerely. "My employers told me all about you. I know your father sired you with the genes of his own great-great-grandmother, Veronica, that with her genetic material, the very foundation of the Ashford line, he created you and Alfred to be the culmination of genius. Veronica would surely be proud. I know you created T. Veronica in her honour." Careful, he probably shouldn't mention what had happened to her father. Don't pitch this up. "And that you are the only being alive with access to the virus." "I am the virus," Alexis said coolly, studying him through narrowed eyes. "Yes, of course," Wesker said. God, he hated this diplomatic shit. He was terrible at it, but he wanted to impress her, to impress upon her how valuable she was to certain interested parties. "So," he continued, thinking how much easier things would have been if he'd gotten to her in stasis. I would like it very much. We would all appreciate it if you would agree to accompany me to a private meeting with my employers to discuss an alliance of sorts. I can assure you that you won't be disappointed." She waited to see if he was finished, and then laughed, long and loud. Wesker felt himself flush. It was clear from her tone exactly what she thought of his request. "Fine. Nice time is over." Wesker stepped forward and held out his hand. "We want a sample of T. Veronica," he said, the gloss disappearing from his voice, "and I'm going to have to insist that you give it to me." As he started down the stairs, just for a second, he thought she was going to do it, but then she started to change, and he stopped thinking anything. He could only stare, his awe returning tenfold. A step down, and her dress burned away in searing veins of golden light, the light coming from her body. Another step, and her flesh changed, turned a deep grey, her hair disappearing, grey flesh locks growing from the top of her head and flopping down to frame her face. Her nakedness was transformed with her next step, as rough, pebbled armour grew over one leg, and her groin curled up to support a rounded breast to cover her right arm. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, she no longer resembled Alexia Osford. His breath taken away, Wesker reached for her, and with the back of her hand, she struck him, and then he was flying, landing in a heap by the front door. such power. Yep, naked monster lady. He stood up, understanding that force might be useful, and prepared himself to move, to use his own power. And with a smile, she waved her hand, and fire burst up from the marble floor, lines of it surrounding him, beckoned to life by her slender fingers. She lowered her hand, and the flames went down, but didn't die, still burning from burrstone. Wesker knew then that it was over. If she chose to spur him, he'd be lucky. Without another word, he turned and walked out, running as soon as the door had closed behind him. The part creature left, and only seconds later the young man followed, believing that he'd escaped unseen. Alexia watched them run, amused but slightly disappointed. She had expected more. The part creature was no threat, and she decided to spur him. His arrogance had pleased her, if not his pathetic offer. The young man, though, brave and self-sacrificing, loyal, compassionate, physically a good specimen, and he loved his sister, who was about to die. It would make for an interesting physiological reaction. Alexia decided that she would create a confrontation for them to interact. She would test a new form for herself and see if his grief made him bolder, or if it proved to be a liability. She laughed, suddenly imagining a suitable and apt form to take. Except for Alfred, no one had known the simple secret of tea Veronica, that it was based on the chemistry of a queen ant. She would try an insectile configuration, experience the strengths and advantages that such a form would propose. Her disappointment was past. The girl and her boy would die, and then she would indulge herself with the young man. Okay. Next, chapter 16. Okay. Through the rooms and halls of a mansion, Claire had run, afraid to hear him scream again. Afraid not to, because she didn't know where to look. Past the plushy, decorated hall, she found herself in a prison area, cells on either wall, the environment cold and dark once more. A lone virus carrier reached for her from behind bars, wailing. "Steve!" Her voice echoed back at her, full of tension and fear, but Steve didn't answer. There was a thick metal door to her right, different than the others, reinforced by bands of steel. She opened it, stepping into a small, bare room that opened into a much larger one. "Steve!" No answer, but the bigger room was long and dimly lit, a kind of huge hall, and she couldn't see what was at the other end. She saw that there was a suspended gate between the small room and the hall, which definitely gave her pause. She looked around and found a piece of broken wood on the floor, then wedged it between the outer door and its frame, not wanting to end up locked inside. She hurried into the giant hall, intimidating, oversized statues of knights lining the heavily shadowed walls, her anxiety growing with every passing second. Where was he? Why had he screamed? She was halfway down the hall when she saw him, slumped in a chair at the far end, some kind of restraining bar across his chest. Oh God. Claire ran, and as she got closer, she could see that the bar was a huge axe, a halberd, the blade firmly entrenched in the wall next to him. He seemed very small and very young, his eyes closed and head down, but she could see that he was breathing and felt less anxious. She reached his side and pulled at the giant axe, but it wouldn't budge. She crouched next to him, touching his arm, and he stirred, opened his eyes. "Claire." "Steve, thank God you're all right. What happened? How did you get here?" Steve pursed at the long axe handle, but couldn't move it either. "Alexia. It had to be Alexia. She looked just like Alfred. She injected me with something. She said she was going to do what she had done to her father, but she was going to get it right this time." He shoved at the axe, straining, but it wasn't moving. In other words, she was whacked. I guess she and Alfred were pretty close after all. Steve trailed off, his cheeks suddenly flushing with colour. His hands started to twitch, his body trembling. "What is it?" Claire asked, afraid, so afraid because his body was hunching over, his fingers clenching to his fists, his eyes wild and terrified. Claire. His voice dropped an octave, her name becoming a growl, and then he was writhing in the chair, his clothes ripping, his mouth. He opened his mouth, and a liquid moan came out, frightened at first, but then angry, furious. "No," Claire whispered, started to back away, and Steve grabbed the halberd, wrenching it out of the wall. Standing up, his body continued to hunch over, his head dropping down, muscles rippling beneath skin that was turning to a grey-green. Spikes rose up from his left shoulder, 2, 3 of them, as his hands elongated, as a giant bloodless wound grew across his back, as his eyes turned red and animal. The thing that had been Steve Burnside opened its mouth and screamed, enraged, and Claire turned and sprinted away, sick with loss and fright, running for all she was worth. The monster came after her, swinging his massive axe, the sharp edge whistling through the air. She could feel the wind from the swinging blade and somehow find more speed, her legs pumping, pushing her faster. The monster swung again, hit something, the sound vast and deafening. Faster, faster, the small room just ahead, and the gate was coming down, was about to lock her into the hall of the monster. How? Didn't matter. She had to go faster still, or she was dead. With one final brutal push, Claire dove for the shrinking space between the bottom of the gate and the floor, sliding in on her stomach, the gate crashing closed behind her. The monster roared, began swinging the axe with abandon, sparks flying as it attacked the metal bars. In shock, Claire watched it break through 3 of them, bending the steel by the very ferocity of its blows, before she realized she could get out. Door. I propped the door open, she thought dazedly, and stood up, took a single step toward her escape. And then something broke through the wall with a crash. Not the monster, a thing that wrapped around her like a constrictor, lifting her, another of the tentacles. The monster continued to hack at the metal. It would break through in seconds, and the tentacle had her tightly in its rubbery grasp. Awakened from her daze, Claire beat at her captor, pried at it, but the matter was impervious. It simply held her, waiting for the monster to breach the gate. It wanted to beat her and cut her. It wanted to rip her apart, so it slammed the weapon into the bars over and over, and finally, there was a hole it could pass through. She was making noises in the grip of the thing that held her, gasping noises that made its blood hot and excited, and made it raise the axe, lusting for the end of her. It brought the axe down hard, remembering what he'd told her, promised her. "You can get the next one. I will..." And he stopped, the blade almost touching her skull. The tentacle waited, gripped her tighter, and he remembered. Claire. Steve lifted the axe again. Strong. He was so strong, and slammed it down into the tentacle, slicing through. In a spray of green fluid, the thick coil snapped and hit him in the chest, throwing him into the wall before retreating. He felt and heard ribs break, felt the boil of his blood cooling, felt his strength going away. The pain came, sharp and dull and everywhere, but he opened his eyes and she was there. She was safe. She was reaching for his hand, Claire Redfield, reaching for his hand with tears in her eyes. The monster was gone. She reached out to hold his hand, and he lifted it to his face, to his beautiful dying face, laying it across his cheek. "You're warm," he whispered. "Hang on," she said, pleading, the knot in her throat choking her. "Please, my brother came, and he'll take us with him. Please don't die." Steve's eyes were fluttering, as though he were trying very hard to stay awake. "I'm glad your brother came," he whispered, his voice fading, "and I'm glad I met you. I love you." On the last word, his head fell forward, his chest falling and not rising again, and then Claire was alone. Steve was gone. Chapter 17. Chris ran, knowing that their time was short as long as Alexia Ashford was alive, afraid that she might already have gotten to Claire. Claire, he shouted, banging his fist on every door he passed. It didn't matter, his shouting. If Alexia was even half as powerful as he suspected, she already knew where he was and where Claire was. Please don't hurt her, he thought. The thought repeating itself as he ran down another hall, through a door, another hall, and another. He didn't know if anything could stop Alexia, but if he could find Claire and get them to the evac elevator, he meant to try and trigger the self-destruct system before leaving. Alexia was halfway to omnipotence and purely evil. She was an apocalypse waiting to happen, and she had to be stopped. Claire. Through a familiar hallway, another Spencer State copy, through a door that opened into some kind of shadowy prison, holding cells lining the walls. He had to find her. If he couldn't leave. He wanted Alexia dead, but he wouldn't endanger Claire's life, not for anything, and getting her out took absolute priority. And somebody was crying behind one of the closed doors. Chris stopped running and listened, trying not to breathe, tuning out the relentless banging of a virus carrier locked in another cell, another gasping wail. Claire, oh, thank God you're alive. He ripped open the door, ready to hurt anything even close to her, and saw her sitting on the floor, sobbing, her arms wrapped around a young man, his naked body bruised and pitiful. He was dead. Ah, shit. It could only be Steve, Claire's friend, and though he was sorry for the boy he had never met, Chris's heart was breaking for her. She looked so fragile, so alone. Something else to lay at Alexia's doorstep. Chris had no doubt that Steve had died because of that crazy bitch, but as much as he wanted to sit down and comfort Claire, to hold her hand and let her grieve, he knew they had to get out. We have to go now, Claire, he said, as gently as possible, and was relieved when she nodded, carefully laying her friend down, closing his eyes with one trembling hand. She kissed him on the forehead and then stood up. Okay, she said, nodding again. I'm ready. She didn't look back, and in spite of everything, he was proud of her. She was strong, stronger than he would have been if he had been asked to leave someone he'd cared about. Together, they ran back into the hall, Chris figuring that they had to be close to the southwest corner of the building, where he had landed the jet and seen the emergency evacuation elevator. The self-destruct system was presumably close enough to the elevator to make a fast escape possible. If they could just get to that elevator, he'd check every floor on the way up. There were stairs at the south end of the hall, and Chris ran for them. Chris at his side. He could feel Claire at his side. He could feel the seconds ticking past as they hurried up the steps. Felt like time was closing in on them, that Alexia was finished playing. Through the door at the top of the stairs, running out onto a giant metal grid platform, and Chris laughed out loud when he looked behind them, saw the nondescript doors of the emergency elevator. What? Claire asked. He motioned at the doors, grinning. That'll take us straight to the jet. Claire nodded, not smiling, but she looked relieved. Good, let's go. Chris had turned back to look at the wall across from the lift. I've got to check something first, he said, wanting to take a closer look at the corner door. It looked like a security door. You go. I'll be right there. Forget it, Claire said firmly. She walked after him, her eyes red from crying, but her chin set and determined. No way, we're splitting up again. Chris leaned down to look at the door's locking mechanism and sighed, standing back up. They were probably at the self-destruct system already. The lock was complicated and unique, requiring a key that he didn't have. Besides which, to the right of the door was a locked-down grenade launcher of some kind, one he didn't recognise, the bar holding it down labelled emergency release only. Just as well, we should get out while we can, he thought, but wasn't happy about it. How much more powerful could Alexia become before another chance like this one? Hey, wait a sec, Claire said, and began rummaging through the small pack around her waist. Before he could ask, she was holding up a slender metal key, shaped like a dragonfly. There was no question that it would fit the lock. "I found it back at Rockford," she said, bending over and pressing it into the indentation. It fit perfectly, the lock releasing with a solid metallic clink. "You're going to set off the self-destruct, aren't you?" Claire said, not really a question. "Do you have the code?" Chris didn't really answer, thinking that there were an amazing number of coincidences in life, and sometimes they worked to one's advantage. "Code Veronica," he said softly, and pulled the door open, ready to take it all down, understanding that it was meant to be. Chapter 18. The boy was dead, but the girl wasn't. And now the young man was trying to destroy Alexi's home, and it wasn't a game, or an experiment, or something to observe. He had to die, in pain and misery. How had he dared to consider such a thing? He should be on his knees in front of her, a worthless supplicant for her to do with as she wished. How dare he? Alexia saw the siblings walking away from their treacherous deed, felt them wishing to leave the automated sequence, as the automated sequence began, lights and sounds flashing, systems shutting down throughout the terminal. Their perfidy was useless, of course. She would be able to stop the destruct sequence with a minimum of effort, using her control over the organic to sever every connection in the facility. But it was the thought behind that the act that so infuriated her. He had witnessed the glory of her capabilities. He had seen it and fled in terror, and yet he could fancy himself worthy to take a life such as hers. Alexia gathered herself, drawing all of her power in, becoming complete. She knew that the young man had picked up a weapon and had been sitting next to the keyboard, a revolver that someone had left behind. She didn't object, knowing that the firearm would give him hope, and that for a victory to be complete, the victor had to take everything. She would take his hope, she would take his sister's life, and then she would take his. When she was whole, she imagined herself becoming liquid, travelling through the structure of her surroundings as easily as the organic extensions she controlled. And then she was doing so, moving to confront the interlopers. They were startled, as if they had expected to succeed. She slid out from inside her organic carrier, unfolding herself, turning to look into their dull eyes, their wincing sheep's faces. She watched her, curious in spite of her anger. They argued in front of her, he insisting that he would handle things, that the girl should flee. The girl accepted, but reluctantly, insisting in turn that he should survive. Following that ludicrous statement, the girl turned and ran for the elevator. Alexia moved to intercept, raising her hand to smite the girl, and her performance opened in her flesh, distracting her. A bullet had entered her body. She turned and smiled at him, at the gun in his hand, and reached into herself, pulling the bullet out and tossing it toward him. As gratifying as his expression was, the girl was gone by the time she turned back. It was time to expand her boundaries, Alexia decided, to show him what she was, what she could do, and to put the fear of God into him. Because as she closed her eyes, wishing, she stopped being Alexia Ashford and became wrath, divine and merciless. Chapter 19. Oh wait, there's 20 chapters. Okay, Chapter 19. The self-destruct sequence has been activated, a recording intoned, reverberating through the room, crowding out the rest of its message. You have 4 minutes, 30 seconds to reach minimum safe distance. Combined with the sirens and flashing emergency lights, Chris was on sensory overload before the fight even began. Alexia raised her hand to hit Claire, and Chris fired, the .357 bucking in his hand, the shot blasting over the self-destruct alarms, deafeningly explosive. Yes, a clean hit, right through the gut, and Claire was already at the elevator, pushing the button, stepping inside. But instead of bleeding, instead of faltering even a step, Alexia smiled at him. She lifted one of her slender grey hands and pushed it into her body. The flesh melding seamlessly, flowing like water. A second later, she held up the round he had nailed her with and gently tossed it in his direction. Bad. This is very, very bad, Chris thought numbly. And then she started to change. The lithe grey female crouched on the metal grid, and her liquid flesh started to tremble, to form tiny peaks and dips all across her body, the tissue bubbling, expanding. The peaks became mountains, the dips valleys, all of it grey and swelling as her limbs started to fold in on themselves. Her arms curved over and joined the growing mass, the legs disappearing into it, the texture turning rough and striated, veins like cables rising, and she kept swelling. Her head rolled down and became part of the giant rounded body of her, grey becoming muscle tissue red, the purple and blue of blood vessels networking across like a tide. You have 4 minutes to reach minimum safe distance, someone said, but Chris barely heard her. He was backing away, becoming more and more convinced that this was not going to end well. The elevator was blocked, and she just kept getting bigger. Thick tentacles pushed out from beneath the elephantine mass, undulating like waves, spreading out across the platform. Chris's back hit a wall, stopping him, and the massive, tumorous thing, suddenly rose up, as if unbending from some non-existent waste, spreading like giant wings, a dragonfly's wings, raising a contorted and deformed half-human face. The face opened its mouth, and a gigantic roaring shriek spilled out, the wings trembling from the raw power of the sound, and then it spit at him, a thin stream of yellow-green bile that splashed on the platform at his feet and began to eat through the metal. "Shit," Chris shouted, and barely jumped out of the way as one of the tentacles slashed forward. He had to watch the mouth and tentacles at the same time, and from rounded, quivering pink spheres that had grown up around the base of the giant body, moving things began to crawl out. Chris ran to the farthest corner from the Alexia thing and raised the .357, not sure where to shoot. The small sub-creatures were landing on the platform, some like flat, rounded rocks with tentacles, some like beetles, some like nothing he'd ever seen before, and they were all coming toward him, moving fast. The eyes, if you can't kill it, maybe you can blind it, but the eyes were already blind, round grey holes with darkness underneath, and he'd already seen how effective bullets were against her flesh. That decided for him. Chris took aim and fired, and the pulsating, bloated creature was screaming again, this time in pain, one of her wings fluttering down to the platform. A few of the small organisms had reached him, one of the beetle creatures leaping onto his leg, trying to climb up. Disgusted, he brushed it off, and there was another to take its place, and a third. A tentacle flew at his face, shot from one of the rounded stone shapes. Chris blocked it, but barely. "Move. You have 3 minutes, 30 seconds to reach minimum safe distance." Chris ran along the back wall, reached the other corner in front of the creature and targeted again, trying for another wing. The shot went high, but the next one hit. It howled, the broken wing hanging from shredded connecting tissue, and then spit again, the stream of bile missing his face by inches. The thing now had only its 2 uppermost wings, and though he knew it, he had heard it, it didn't seem to have suffered anything close to serious injury. "I have 2 rounds left." There had to be something he could do, some way to stop it. The self-destruct was going to blow all of them to hell, and it would be his fault. He leapt away as another tentacle whipped out from the creature's base, trying to think. This was a goddamn emergency, and he had to think. Emergency release only. The bloated monster shrieked. More of the beetles were jumping at him, but he ignored them, having only to turn his head to see the inset weapon next to the door, the one with the lockdown bar. A grenade or rocket launcher, whatever it was beautiful, but the bar was still down. It hadn't been released. "You have 2 minutes to reach minimum safe distance." Ka-chunk! The bar flipped up. Chris snatched it out, lifting and aiming it at the creature's swollen guts. He didn't know what it would do, but he hoped it was good. He hoped it would shut that bitch down. There was no safety, nothing to chamber. Chris pulled the trigger, and a fury of white light and heat leapt from the barrel, blowing into the fat belly like an arrow into a balloon. The effect was huge, the explosion monstrous. A fountain of blood and grey jelly splattered out from the gaping, ragged hole, back splattering onto his face, but he only had eyes for the screaming Alexia beast as its flesh and bone form gave out, deflating. The upper body of the creature was trying to pull free from the dying mass, the two wings flailing frantically at the air, but with only two, it couldn't free itself, and so it was dying. He knew because he could see its blood draining away, because the colour of its horrid flesh was changing, turning ashy, the sub-creatures shrivelling because of the absolute, complete hatred on its face and the absolute surprise. As the Alexia monster fell silent and began to sag, her features dripping, Chris heard that he had 1 minute left. Claire. He dropped the incendiary launcher and ran. Okay, chapter 20. Claire felt like shit, and there was nothing she could do about it. Steve was dead, and Chris would either come or he wouldn't, and whatever happened, everything was going to blow up pretty soon, and she had no say in any of it. You have 2 minutes to reach minimum safe distance, the computer politely informed her, and Claire extended her middle finger toward the closest speaker. If there was a hell, she knew what they played in the elevators instead of music. There was only one jet where the elevator had let her out, and Claire sat on the railing in front of it, her arms tight crossed, her stare fixed on the elevator doors. She watched and waited, her anxiety building, a part of her believing completely that he wasn't coming, as alarms blurred through the most empty hangar, echoing back at her. Don't leave me, Chris, she thought, clutching herself tighter. She thought of Steve, remembering the laugh attack he had inspired back on the island, how he had looked at her like she was crazy. Come now, Chris, she thought, closing her eyes and wishing it as hard as she could. She couldn't lose him too. Her heart wouldn't be able to stand it. There was 1 minute to reach minimum safe distance. When the building started to rumble beneath her feet, she thought she might cry, but there were no tears. She went back to watching the elevator door instead, certain now that he was gone, so sure that when the door opened, when he stepped out, she thought she might be hallucinating. Chris? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, and he was running toward her, splashes of blood and something else smeared across his face and arms, and that was when she understood that he was real. She wouldn't have hallucinated him with goop on his face. Chris, get in, he commanded, and Claire jumped into the second seat, happy and scared and anxious, lonely and relieved, wishing that Steve was with them and sad that he wasn't. There were more feelings, seeming dozens, but at the moment she couldn't handle any of them. She pushed them aside and didn't think at all, didn't feel anything but hope. Chris tucked them in tight and started pushing buttons, the small jet roaring to life. Above them, the ceiling slid apart, the storm clouds breaking up overhead as he lifted them out of the hangar, smooth and easy. A few seconds later, they were blasting away, leaving the dying facility behind them. Chris's shoulders relaxed, and he wiped his hand across his forehead, trying to rub off the sour-smelling gunk. I could use a shower, he said lightly, and the tears finally welled up, spilling over her lower lashes. Chris, I thought I'd lost you too. Don't leave me alone again, okay? She asked, doing what she could to keep the tears out of her voice. Chris hesitated, and she instantly knew why. Knew that it wasn't over for either of them. That was too much to ask. Umbrella, she said, and Chris was nodding. We have to settle this once and for all, he said tightly. We have to, Claire. Claire didn't know what to say, finally opting not to say anything. When the explosion came a moment later, she didn't look. She closed her eyes instead, leaning back into her seat, and hoped that when she finally slept, she wouldn't dream. Okay, final chapter, the epilogue. Miles away, Wesker heard the explosion and could see the smoke rising shortly afterward, thick black plumes of it. He thought about circling the jet back, but decided against it. There was no point. If Alexia wasn't dead, his people would find out soon enough. Hell, the world would find out soon enough. I hope you were in there, Redfield, he said softly, smiling a little. Of course he was. Chris wasn't bright enough or fast enough to have gotten out in time. Although he might be lucky enough, Wesker had to concede that much. Redfield had the luck of the devil. It was a shame about Alexia turning them down. She had been something terrifying and evil, but definitely something. His employers weren't going to be happy when he came back without her, and he couldn't blame them. They'd shelled out plenty for the Rockford attack, and he had practically promised them results. They'll live. If they don't like it, they can find themselves a new boy. Trent, on the other hand. Wesker grimaced, not looking forward to their next meeting. He owed the man. After the Spencer fiasco, Trent had, quite literally, pulled his ass out of the fire and arranged for him to be fixed up, better than new, and he had been responsible for Wesker's introduction to his current employers, men with real aspirations for power and the means to obtain it. And he had never admit to it out loud, but Trent scared him. He was so smooth, well-mannered, and soft-spoken, but with a glitter in his eyes that made him always seem to be laughing, like everything was a joke, and he was the only one who got it. In Wesker's experience, the ones who laughed were the most dangerous. They didn't feel like they had anything to prove. They were usually at least slightly insane. I'm just glad we're on the same side, Wesker assured himself, believing it because he wanted to. Because going up against someone like Trent was a bad plan. Well, he could worry about Trent later, after he had made the proper apologies to the proper agents. At least Boy Scout Redfield was dead, and he was alive and kicking. And he was alive and kicking, working for the side that was going to win when all was said and done. Wesker smiled, looking forward to the end. It was going to be spectacular. The sun had come out and was reflecting against the snow, creating a brilliant radiance, blinding in its perfection. The small plane shot away, its shadow chasing it across the sparkling plains. The end. About the author. SD, that's Stephanie Danielle Perry, writes multimedia novelizations in the fantasy/science fiction/horror realm for love and money. In addition to the Resident Evil series, she is the best-selling author of Avatar, the 2-volume relaunch of the Star Trek Deep Space Nine novels, which begins the arc of stories set after the TV series, and Star Trek Section 31 Cloak. She's also a 2-time contributor to the acclaimed short story anthology Star Trek The Lives of Dax. Her other works include several Aliens novels as well as the novelizations of Time Cop and Virus. Under the name Stella Howard, she's written an original novel based upon the television series Xena Warrior Princess. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and beloved dogs. And the Resident Evil Saga. So there are the other books by S.D. Perry. So there's Umbrella Conspiracy, Caliban Cove. So number 1 is Umbrella Conspiracy, and number 2 is Caliban Cove. Number 3 is City of the Dead. 4 is Underworld. 5 is Nemesis. 6 is Code Veronica. And then the last one, which is called Zero, is based on Resident Evil 0. But that's it all done. Okay, so that's Resident Evil Code Veronica done. So next time I will stream something, it'll be Resident Evil 4. But I think there's like TV shows or movies or something that takes place between Code Veronica and 4, so I'll have to, if there's any of those, then I'll watch those first and then start Resident Evil 4. But yeah, there we go.